Now that we have a nice way to look at all the images in our database, we'll need to add some functionality to insert images in our database. This not only happens with the insert methods that we've added earlier, we also need to be able to take a file and send that to the database. That file upload functionality comes in two parts. The first part is to be able to actually select a file, whether it's from your system or the network. The second part is to save that file back into the database and insert the relevant metadata inside the database as well. Let's build the first part of our file upload functionality by allowing the user to navigate through folders on their computer. One of the greatest enhancements of .NET 3.5 is the ability to manage multimedia more richly. Later in this series, we'll show you how you can save files to the database using the .NET controls. Let's begin by configuring our file upload controls. Let's go back into Design View for our Create Item form. Below the item data, let's add some functionality to allow us to upload files into our database. Go to your toolbox, go to the Containers tab, and drag over a Group Box control. This will group together all related functionality for file upload. Resize the group box to be a bit larger. Let's give it a name. In the Properties window, change the text property to be Upload Images. Let's also give our group box a name. Let's call it Group Box Upload Images. Now let's drag over some controls. It would be convenient for the user if they had the ability to look at the files that are on their system. We can provide that functionality. In your toolbox, drag over the Open File dialog and drag it into your component tray. This is a non-visible control, so you'll only see it down in the component tray and not on the actual form. This will allow us to browse through all the files on our desktop or any other machine that we have access to. Let's give it a name, called Open File Dialog Image. The next thing we need to add is a control to activate this Open File dialog. We can use a button for that. Let's drag over a button. Drag it inside the Upload Images group box. Let's call it Button Browse. Let's change a text property to be 3 periods and resize it to be a bit smaller. The next thing we need to do is capture the file name that the user selects. We can either store that behind the scenes, but it's much more polite to allow the user to see that their file has actually been selected. We can store that information inside of a text box. Select the text box control and drag it over to be near the button that you've just created. Modify the text box properties, and let's give it a name. Let's call it Text Box File Name. Now let's configure the click functionality for a button. Double-click on the button to navigate to the click event. Add a try-catch handler by typing in try and selecting tab twice. Inside the try handler, let's type in a bit of code. The first thing we want to do is configure the properties of our Open File dialog image. This is the control that will pop up and allow the user to browse their system. By configuring these properties up front, before we actually show the control, the user will automatically see the default settings that we wish to use. The first thing we want to set as the default settings is the initial directory. Remember in the very beginning of this series, we actually configured our settings for the image upload path? You can find that in your Solution Explorer in the settings file. We had configured it by default to be the photos directory inside your desktop. You can always change this. Let's use that same image upload path to configure our file dialog's initial directory. Select Open File Dialog Image from the drop-down list, choose the initial directory property, and set this equal to Anti-Curator Admin Properties, Settings. This is actually a place where Visual Basic is much more concise. Instead of drilling down into the Anti-Curator Admin Properties settings, you could use the handy My object instead in Visual Basic. Select Default, and then select the image upload path. As you can see, Visual Studio will automatically peruse through any of the properties that you created by scratch and pick them up in IntelliSense. Add a semicolon. Next thing we'll need to do is change the title of our dialog box. Select Open File Dialog Image, select the title property, choose this to reflect Select Single File to Upload. Next, we'll need to populate the file name. Because the user hasn't selected a file just yet, let's make sure we symbolize that with an empty string. Type in Open File Dialog Image .filename equals string empty. Let's configure the help icon's visibility to be false. Type in Open File Dialog Image .show help equals false. The next thing we'll need to do is the most useful property. This is the filter property. You've probably experienced this if you ever worked with Windows. When you use the file dialog control, you can actually filter to only look for files of a certain extension. In this case, we only want to look for files that are images. We can set that by applying a filter. Instead of typing this by hand, let's grab this from our snippet file. Go to your desktop. Inside your project files directory, inside Chapter 7, you'll find a snippets directory. Open the snippets file and copy the text into your clipboard. Return back to Visual Studio. Type in Open File Dialog Image.filter equals and paste in the data from your clipboard. Type in the semicolon button to close this. If you look at your filter, it's going to filter by any images that are bitmaps, JPEGs, or GIFs. It'll do that by using the *extension to filter through files. Alternately, the user has the All Files option to look at all files. Now that we have our file dialog configured, we can now show it. Type in dialog result _result equals Open File Dialog Image .show dialog. We'd like to capture the results of that show dialog, whether the user went through with the selection or whether they hit cancel. We can do this with an if statement. Type in if, parentheses, result, double equals, dialog result, cancel. As you can see, it automatically enumerates through all the options, whether it's abort, cancel, ignore, no, none, etc. In this case, we just want to take a look at cancel. And if it's cancel, we don't want to do anything. But if it isn't, if it's anything else, we'll take the file name that they've selected and populate that into our text box control. That way, the user knows that the selection has occurred successfully. Inside the curly braces, type in text box file name .text and set that equal to the results from the Open File Dialog Image .filename property. Add a semicolon, save all your changes, and now press F5 to run the application. Select the Create Item button, and now you see we have item functionality that looks significantly better than what we had in the beginning. We not only have the ability to peruse through images, we actually have preliminary functionality to upload images. By selecting our Browse button dialog box, we now can look at different images that we have available on our machine. We've created a few sample images for you in the Photos directory that you can use later in this series as we begin to add save functionality to our system. Cancel out, return back to Visual Studio, stop and close the application.